June is LGBTQIA plus Pride Month, but what is Pride and how did it start? So before we get into that, let's just have a quick look at the LGBTQIA plus community. Do you know what each of these letters actually stands for? So L is for lesbian. So lesbians are women who have relationships with or are attracted to other women and identify as a lesbian. The G stands for gay, which is typically men who are attracted to or want to have relationships with other men and identify as gay. The B stands for bisexual. So bisexual people are attracted to or have relationships with people who are can be the same gender as them, but also could be a different gender to them, and to identify as bisexual. The T stands for trans. So there are lots of different identities that come under the kind of like trans umbrella term, things like transgender or transsexual or agender or gender fluid or non-binary. So there are lots and lots of different ways of identifying as trans, but broadly people who sit within the trans umbrella are people whose gender is not the same as the one that they were assigned at birth. So when a baby is born and the doctors look at them and decide based on their body that they are a boy, but then when that person begins to grow up, they actually are a girl, or maybe they're not gendered, then they might identify as trans. They might identify as a trans woman, they might identify as agender or gender fluid, or another kind of identity, or they may choose not to use a label at all. And we put all of those kinds of non-cisgendered gender identities under the trans umbrella. The Q can stand for a couple of things. Often it is used for queer, but some people also use the Q to mean questioning, because the LGBTQIA plus community recognises that not everyone who's a part of that community has fully decided how they want to identify, or are like maybe still working through what their sexuality or their gender is. When we say queer, this is a political term which can refer to someone's gender identity, gender representation, or sexual orientation or sexual identity. So there are lots of different ways of being queer, and the word queer actually began as a slur that was used against LGBTQIA plus people, but people within the community have reclaimed it and used it as a political term, which demonstrates that not only are you a member of the community, but you're also, actively fighting to make space in the world for the community. The I stands for intersex. So someone with an intersex condition is someone whose hormones, or maybe their body or their chromosomes, are different from the kind of like average when we're talking about sex characteristics or other kinds of physical identifiers of our biological sex. So someone who is intersex may be born with both parts of a body that we typically assign to be female and parts of a body that we typically assign to be male. They may have a different rate of or balance of male and female hormones. There are lots of different types of intersex variants and intersex conditions that people can have. The final letter is the A, and that stands for asexual. So asexuality is someone who identifies as asexual may do so because they are not attracted to or interested in having sexual relationships with other people. There are also identities like aromantic, which might recognise that you have an interest in a sexual relationship, but you don't want to have a romantic relationship with people. And asexuality, much like gender and sexual orientation, is a spectrum. So there are also people who identify maybe as demisexual, which means that you do experience some kind of interest sexually in other people, but it sort of sits somewhere between none at all and an experience more typical of lots of other people. So some people who identify as demisexual, for example, don't want to have sexual relationships with people that they don't know, or they have to have a deep emotional connection before they find that they have any kind of sexual feelings. Finally, often we refer to the LGBTQIA plus community, or LGBTQ plus community. You might have seen it as well. And that plus is really important because it recognizes that there are lots and lots of other ways of expressing your gender or your sexuality beyond just the ones in this acronym. So, getting back to Pride, on the 28th of June in 1969, the morning of that day was something called the Stonewall riots that took place at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, which is a part of New York. So the Stonewall Inn was a gay club, and it's at the time in the 1960s and earlier in America and all across the world, it was targeted by police violence because of widespread discrimination against the LGBTQIA plus community. So for a bit of context, in America in the 1950s, there was something called the gay purges, which was a widespread identification of and firing or evicting or other forms of persecution of people who were found to be homosexual or trans. And there was a lot of discrimination, which was perfectly legal, so it was okay not to hire people because of their sexuality or their gender orientation or expression, and there was also quite a lot of police violence against the community. So there were often raids against pubs and clubs like the Stonewall Inn, where police would burst in and they would enforce things like the 3-item rule. So this was basically a law that said that you had to have at least 3 items of clothing that were the correct items of clothing for your sex or gender. So if society has decided that you're a boy, then that means that you have to be wearing at least 3 boys' items of clothing at all time. Or if society has decided that you're a girl, then you have to be wearing 3 items of clothing that are girls' clothing. And so police would come into places like the Stonewall Inn, and they would take people into the bathrooms. They would make them take off their clothes so that they could count how many items of clothing people were wearing, and then they would arrest people who weren't complying with the rules. And they were doing all of these other kinds of quite violent and oppressive things. On this particular morning, when the police broke in and they were enforcing this rule and they were taking people out into vans and arresting them, quite a large crowd gathered. And there's anecdotal evidence that a butch lesbian who'd been arrested, a woman called Stormy Delavery, where she was being brought into a van, she turned to the crowds that were watching and said, well, why aren't you guys doing anything? And in response to that, the crowd erupted into the Stonewall riots. So this was 6 days of rioting. Now, a lot of people characterize the Stonewall riots as very violent, but for people, a lot of the activists who were there, they've described it as less of a violent riot and more of a protest, which was protesting against, it was a reaction to the police oppression that people were facing. The next year, in 1970, there were some marches across America that were also on June the 28th or June the 29th. So people were trying to commemorate the Stonewall riots. And the Stonewall riots weren't the first protests that we see within the LGBTQI plus community, but they really were a catalyst for this particular event, the Pride March. And people started marching on the last Saturday in June, in order to commemorate those riots, and they started referring to those marches as Pride. So the first Pride March took place in the UK in 1972 in London, and on the first Pride March in London, there were 2,000 people who marched through London to commemorate the Stonewall riots. If you contrast that to in 2019, the most recent physical Pride March, there were 1.5 million people there. So Pride has gone from this very, very small event to one of the top 10 tourist attractions in London. It's grown massively. Pride has been used by the LGBTQIA plus community for lots and lots of different things. So originally it was to commemorate the riots, but it's been used to sort of champion or to protest lots of very relevant events within the community. So it's been used to criticize the government's response to the AIDS epidemic. It's been used to oppose oppressive laws like Section 28. It's been used to demonstrate that the LGBTQIA plus people, like it is a community of people, it exists, and it's being discriminated against. More recent ways that it's been used, more recent topics has been used to talk about marriage equality. It's been used to criticize immigration policy in the UK. It's used across the world in the 78 countries where same-sex relationships are in some way criminalized. Pride marches are still used to just demand the right to exist within society. So pride has been used in lots and lots of different ways in lots of different places as a political tool. However, for a lot of people, Pride is a party. It's a celebration of what it means to be LGBTQIA+, and it is one day in one place where you can go and forget about discrimination or forget about oppression and just have a really nice time, because you get to be with so many people from the community. So for some people, it's really important to have it as a celebration, and for other people, it's really important to have it as a protest. And as a consequence, a lot of people think that Pride is sort of losing its roots, it's losing its activism. And this is definitely the case in like really large Pride events like London Pride, where there's a lot of corporate sponsorship, and you're now maybe more likely to see a party bus full of people from a big organization or a big corporation like Amazon than you are to see an LGBTQIA plus charity. And for a lot of people, this makes them feel uncomfortable, especially because within the community, a lot of the ways that people are oppressed or discriminated against has a lot to do with like financial oppression. So within the LGBTQIA plus community, we have some of the most economically disadvantaged groups within societies in, for example, the UK and London and the US, but also Pride is not accessible to everyone. It's a march, which makes it difficult for people maybe have a disability to access. There are lots of people who don't feel comfortable going because they don't see other people who like look like them at Pride, and there are some ways in which Pride has been made to be actively difficult for people to attend. So at the 2018 Pride Parade in London, the parade was actually hijacked by anti-trans protesters, who were then allowed to walk at the front of the parade despite the fact they were carrying transphobic messages. And so for people within the trans community, that made it much harder to go to Pride, because not only might you not be able to see other people from the trans community, but you might see people who are talking about how you don't have the right to exist. So Pride today is very different from like the initial Pride marches, as you might expect, because things evolve over time. But there are lots of ways that Pride has grown, and that's been really good, and there are other ways in which it's not as accessible as it needs to be. The LGBTQI plus community is extremely diverse. We are linked by the words that we use to describe ourselves and the discrimination that we might experience because of who we are. But because it is so diverse, there are lots of different people who need or want different things. And so Pride can't be all things to everyone. That's why there's lots and lots of different Pride parades. Just in the UK, there are dozens of different Pride parades, and there are specific parades like UK Black Pride, which is a festival specifically for people of colour within the community, or Bi Pride UK, which celebrates bisexual identities specifically, and they celebrate and fight for specific groups within the community, which means that they can be more tailored towards those groups' needs. So is Pride still a protest? Some prides are, and Pride is still in some ways, but it's trying to do a lot of other things as well. And the good thing is that there are lots of different prides to kind of enable all those different things.